You're going to have to be overcoming the vestiges of the oligopoly, the aristocracy in the U.S., because they're still going to have the guns and they're still going to have a lot of power. So to the extent that we get to make that happen, it has to happen through elections, or it has to happen through civil unrest if they don't let us have elections. So this is going to be an incredibly messy time. We've come through one of the easiest stretches in human history because we had that unlimited credit card. We had a central bank that could create money in unlimited quantities with no consequence, and governments that could therefore borrow unlimited amounts of money with no consequence. So the average person just thinks the world is this way, that there are always credit card solicitations in your mailbox. You can always get a mortgage at the bank downtown. Your house will always go up in value. Your stock portfolio will always go up. Your pension is insanely generous, and it will be there waiting for you, or Social Security or Medicare. Those, we grew up being told and having it be demonstrated that all of that stuff was true. And the fact that none of it is actually true hasn't sunk in yet. So that's when things get really intense because, we kind of think we've had some civil unrest here with Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party and stuff like that, but we haven't seen anything like what's coming. When, for instance, Chicago firefighters find out that the money for their pension is not there anymore and they're only going to get half of what they thought they were going to get. Or when real inflation, in other words, the real value of the dollar's decline, is twice the cost of living increase on Social Security. Or when huge sections of the country just get laid off because stuff's not working anymore. People will hit the streets when that happens. And that will be part of the conversation. It's not all going to be peaceful, I don't think. Like Gerald Celente likes to say, when people have nothing left to lose, they lose it.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance and Reluctant Preppers. We have this returning guest whom we don't get as often as we'd like, but John Rubino, who's the proprietor of DollarCollapse.com, is here with us again on Liberty and Finance. John, thanks for joining us this Tuesday, April 14, 2020.
Hey, Don, again. It's good to see you again.
We wanted to get you to weigh in on some of the macro forces that are moving and shaking our economic and financial world, and then we're going to get to some viewers' questions, and at the end, let's talk about how things are impacting ordinary people on a very personal level. So could you first give us what's on top of mind for you as you're seeing these tectonic shifts happening in the world around us? And for a website author by the name of DollarCollapse.com, this has got to be riveting times for you, even more than for the ordinary person.
Oh, yeah, this is fascinating stuff for a finance geek, because this is basically once in a lifetime, if not much more than that, situation where we tried an amazing monetary experiment, one that governments have been itching to try since the beginning of time, and individual governments have actually tried the experiment in the past, where they just decide to go to paper or debased metal currencies or whatever, and they that allows them to spend whatever they want to in the short run. But it blows up their currency and they have a massive financial crisis. Well, the world decided to try that experiment again, except everybody did it at once this time. In 1971, we took all the major countries off the last vestiges of the gold standard, which historically limited the increase in the money supply. In other words, if you're a government and you want to fight a big war under a gold standard, you have to go get actual gold from somewhere to pay for it. And that makes it much harder to do the stupid things that governments like to do so much. So in 1971, we decided basically we're going to give every government in the world an unlimited credit card. And human nature being what it is, they did exactly what you'd expect. They abused that power to the max. And now we're the most deeply indebted global society that has ever existed, with the gigantic financial crisis that has to flow from that much debt, right? So that's one thing we have that is independent of everything else. We screwed up our finances. We've got a massive financial crisis coming because of that. However, before we could get there, before we could get to the inevitable global financial crisis, this pandemic hit. And so now we've got these two problems with mutually exclusive solutions. Because if you want to fix the coming global financial crisis or stave it off, you've got to have everybody at work, right? You got to get everybody out working, borrowing money and spending it on silly stuff like we have been doing for the past 40 or so years. But with the pandemic, if you want to fix that, you've got to keep everybody home and basically just lock them down until the virus goes away because of fewer and fewer infections. Well, if you do that, that blows up the economy, right? If everybody stays home. However, if you send everybody back to work, that turbocharges the pandemic. So whatever we do, we end up with one of those two things being made worse by our decisions. So what we have chosen to do is try to stop the pandemic, because that's this unknown. It's terrifying. And people aren't as worried about debt because we've been getting along with higher and higher debt year after year after year for a long time. So we're going to take a global recession, which might be a depression here, in order to stop the pandemic. And, you know, the fact that our finances were so overleveraged and so fragile means that this could turn into one for the ages. You know, this could be the 1930s on steroids, or it could be a global Weimar Germany hyperinflation. We just don't know, because we've never leveraged the world to this point before. And now we're going to find out what happens when an exogenous shock hits or pricks a bubble this big. You know, this is, like you said, it's a fascinating time because it's totally uncharted territory. And I suspect that this is going to be one of the most brutal economies for the next year or two, and possibly for the next decade, that anybody has seen in the history of the human race. So this is going to be a really big deal.
Could we focus in on that topic for the moment? Because my goodness, you're probably aware, and we certainly are on this channel, about the wide range of opinions people have about the origins of the illness and the timing of it, and the expanse of the response, the policy response to it, and on and on and on. What I'm trying to get at here is that you kind of framed that as a kind of a crux of a dilemma. It's like, you know, you're darned if you do, you're darned if you don't. But if we look at it from the perspective of, for those of us who've been paying attention, including yourself, for years, there's been this inexorable progression towards greater and greater bubble territory, huge risk, huge derivative exposure, all this stuff that's been going on. So it's been like there's this huge train wreck that's been waiting to happen, and now all of a sudden there's this bigger thing, and it does kind of have the smell around it of like the dog ate my homework. It's like or an arson covering a crime scene with something that's just so big that we can all just blame everything on that. I mean, we even have a question from a viewer, Anna Krasinski, who says, the hypothesis of, quote, plandemic begs the question, are all the nations in on the lockdown, having all conspired together at the highest levels, G20 private talks, at some point in the past to implement a plandemic, using the fear of contagion excuse to bring down the global failed and dying economic system rapidly in a controlled demolition, to reset all asset values and currencies with the least civil unrest and the least coercive power by violence. A brilliant strategy in theory, but how credible in practice? Just as background to that is, like, this seems to be extraordinarily level of unprecedented global response, policy response to there's been epidemics before. There's been pandemics every so often, and yet we've never had a response like this before. So I guess you could take that in different stages. Do you think there's room for belief that something doesn't look right about the scale of this response as compared to what we've seen in the past, versus just coincidentally the house of cards we were in, you know, even back in like September when they started doing the repos and all that stuff that's going on a quarter before we heard anything about the illness and so on?
Well, you know, this takes us back to a question that I've been at this for a long time, you know, and people have been asking me more or less the same question since the very beginning, which is, okay, are these guys morons, or are they brilliantly carrying out a secret plan, you know? And my response has always been, I don't know, and I'm not sure which is scarier. Are the guys in charge of the global financial system and the global economy just clueless and stumbling along, trying to get through the day by adding more debt to the system? Or are they these evil geniuses leveraging up to the system and siphoning wealth out of the 99% into the accounts of the 1%, with the ultimate goal of blowing up the system, imposing a dictatorship, and turning us all into serfs? And I personally don't have enough evidence one way or the other to form an opinion, and I'm not sure what I hope for, because clueless, bumbling morons with unlimited printing presses and nuclear weapons are pretty terrifying. That's scary enough. And, super genius, evil billionaires in charge of the system is also very scary. But in some ways, at least there's a plan, So I have no idea which I think I would rather see. And I don't know which one we're going to see. But I will say about this particular thing, the coronavirus has some elements of a false flag, which you mentioned, that it just blew up everywhere all of a sudden. Usually it takes a long time for something to spread from country to country to country. And this just came out of nowhere, and within a month we were on lockdown. However, at the same time, governments initially responded in different ways. For instance, Britain and Sweden decided just to let it go. They were going to let it burn through their population, just stand out of the way and see what happens. And it overwhelmed them. So they had to go to major league lockdown, just like everybody else. So it's not clear. Well, it is clear that everybody wasn't on the same page on day one, but most of them ended up on the same page via different routes. Some countries just went immediately to testing everybody in sight, keeping everybody at home, and trying to flatten the curve and send it down to zero. And others decided just to, benignly neglect the virus and see what happens. But they all ended up on lockdown. So that implies to me that not everybody started out with full knowledge of the plan, if there was a plan. So I really have no idea whether the financial crisis or the pandemic are part of a big plan, or whether they're both part of the same big plan. And I honestly don't know which I hope is true.
Well, let's look at it from a different lens. Doug Casey talks about the three levels of effect of this. He says the primary effect is the medical impact of a pandemic, and we're all concerned, and rightly so, about that. Then there's the secondary effect, which is the economic impact, and I'd like to get you to weigh in one more time on what you see as your most likely scenario in that regards. And then the third is the political, social, geopolitical, and liberty impact of policy response. Again, thinking back to 9/11, where we got the Patriot Act and we got the TSA, and those things have never gone away. So I guess we'll let go of the medical response for now, because that's not our primary. We are going to be actually interviewing a medical doctor tomorrow about that, and that'll be quite informative. But secondly, could you talk to us more about what you consider to be, given the wide range of possibilities, perhaps your most likely view of the economic and financial road ahead through this? And then let's take a look at the policy response impact on people's liberties.
Okay, the financial and economic impact is pretty straightforward. Half the world is thrown out of work, which means they're not buying stuff, they're not paying their bills. So we're going to drop into a recession/depression. The numbers are going to be horrendous for the next few months. And then, whether it becomes a capital D depression depends on how long the coronavirus lockdown lasts. If it lasts for 6 months, we're back in the 1930s. Or, depending on how much new currency the central banks of the world shovel out into the world, we're heading into Weimar Germany. One or the other. But it will not be a garden variety recession where we have a couple of quarters of slow growth or slightly negative growth, and then we start digging our way out right away. There's no way to predict how long this lasts. It's going to be brutal for a few months, and it may resolve itself soon if we all go back to work like they're talking about in May. And it may last an extremely long time and scar a whole generation if the virus stays with us for a long time. Now, about the political side of this, there are two kinds of clampdowns and loss of civil liberties. One happens during wars, and we've seen this in American history over and over again. You know, Abraham Lincoln, if a newspaper came out and criticized his handling of the Civil War, he closed down the paper and locked up the editor. FDR in World War II rounded up everybody who looked Japanese and put them in internment camps for the entire war. You know, it was like 5 years of being locked in a fenced enclosure out west. But at the end of the war, we reversed out those emergency measures and went back to more or less the civil liberties that we had before. Now, 9/11 was a different animal because it's terrorism. And the Patriot Act, therefore, might be a different kind of loss of civil liberties for us, because that war, you know, the war on terror never really has to end, right? Because as long as somebody is pissed off about something out there and has access to weapons, which everybody does now. I mean, if you can make a bomb out of fertilizer that can blow up a building, the world is never going to be safe again, because weapons technology is only advancing. And we're going to get better and better at mass destruction going forward. So it's possible that the stuff that happened around 9/11 is with us for the long haul, which would be horrendous, because that means we would have lost a lot of civil liberties permanently. Now, what's happening with the coronavirus remains to be seen, whether it's a war that ends at a certain point, and then whatever we did to control people during that war will be rolled back. Or if it's something that stays with us for a long time. In other words, if it's some kind of recurring thing that has seasons, where it goes away in the hot weather and comes back in cold weather, that means the new powers that government is taking for itself in this crisis might also last a long time, might also be with us for the duration, you know, if the duration is 50 years until we get a perfect cure for this stuff, then so be it. So we can't know exactly what the lasting impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is going to be until we find out how quickly we are able to treat it or protect against it or cure it, and how quickly we get back to work after that. So there's a lot of unknowns here, you know, and they're more an issue of timing than anything else. We kind of know what would happen after a certain thing happens, but we don't know when that resolution will take place. It might be 6 months, it might be 20 years. We just can't know that. So it's completely possible we end up with a big financial crisis, which we were going to get anyhow. You know, that was coming, but this sped it up. So we get the big crisis. We get the currency crisis that follows from the debt crisis. And then we get the currency reset, where we go back to some kind of gold standard or crypto standard or some other commodity standard, something that takes the printing press away from governments. So we get that out of the way. And then it's possible. Again, it's possible. See, none of this stuff is guaranteed. But we have a global discussion about the nature of money, the role of government in the economy, the role of the individual in a free society, and we restructure something that's better than what we have now out of that. We rebuild it out of the rubble. It's also possible that we conclude that this is a failure of capitalism, and so we need to go authoritarian. You know, we need to be a militaristic socialist country going forward, or world going forward, because China and Russia would be completely okay with that already. You know, it's only really the U.S. that's standing in the way of a global dictatorship right now. So, you know, there again, it's not written in stone. The future isn't fixed, and we will almost certainly be around to argue the case when the time comes for limited government, individual freedom, sound money, and basically a return to the founding principles of the U.S. But you don't know who's going to win that argument, because the people saying, well, capitalism did this, at least at a surface level, going to have a point because, the private sector seems to be dominant right now to a lot of observers. And the fact that it's really a partnership between government and an oligopoly, a kind of an aristocracy now, is lost on a lot of people. They see guys running companies and they think, well, that's capitalism. But what it really is an oligarchy. A handful of people who have gotten control of everything, and they're running the system for their own benefit. And that's not capitalism. So that's the case we have to make, is that, a free market capitalist system with sound money and free individuals would be very different from what we have today, and it would be much better in a lot of ways. So we need to go back to that because we totally lost it. We lost that 40 years ago.
Before we go much farther, can we talk about who the we is and how this debate would even get started? Because it seems to me that there's this striking lack of debate and striking lack of participation by the common people or who aren't being consulted about, do you want us to be doing level 4 bioweapons experimentation and it might leak out once in a while? Or, hey, do you want us to be running up unpayable debts for your children and grandchildren? Hey, do you want us to be... It's like, we're not getting consulted on all of this. Or the Federal Reserve saying, we have unlimited power to bail out anybody we want at any amount. It's like, based on who's going to have to pay the other side of that trade in the future. So I'm not sure that the common person has much that they can point to where we're being consulted on these things. How do we get in the conversation?
Actually, Dunnigan, I would take the other side of that argument and say that we are consulted. Every time there's an election in which somebody's promising us a bunch of free stuff and we vote for that person, we have been consulted and we've said, yeah, we'll take that free stuff. You can be our president now. And the reason why people vote against their long-term interests in that way, first of all, is because most of us are kind of short-sighted just by nature. Anyhow, we'll take the bird in hand over, the hard work that gives us 2 birds in a bush 5 years from now. That's capitalism. You delay gratification in the hopes of a much bigger payoff down the road. Well, most people don't think that way innately. And in 1971, we went off the gold standard, we gave ourselves the ability to create money, or the governments got the ability to create money. I was going to say,
let's get this we.
Well, we in the sense of the people we voted for. I mean, most of the people in the country voted for Bill Clinton. They voted for George W. Bush, who invaded a bunch of other countries and did the biggest bailout of all time. They voted for Barack Obama, who continued the bailout and helped implement the surveillance state. These guys won majorities of the voting population after each election or before each election. And, I would argue that most voters didn't understand what they were voting for because they didn't understand the nature of money. Their lifetime had been a time of easy money in which politicians didn't have to prioritize. They didn't have to say no to one constituency in order to kind of sort of help another constituency. They said yes to everybody because they could create the money out of thin air. And as voters, most Americans got used to being taken care of. The idea that somebody might scale back some social program in order to pay down debt, you would get 3% of the vote if you ran on a platform of scaling back Social Security in order to pay off the national debt. I mean, Ron Paul was a pure libertarian who made that case. He got 5% on a good day, in a Western state election. That's all he got, and so I think we have to bear some blame. Individual Americans have to take some responsibility for how we ended up. We got the government we deserved, and we're going to get the crisis that we deserve eventually too. And so then it becomes a question of, can we educate ourselves in time? Can the average person figure out what went wrong really, and participate in a discussion that leads us to a better system? And to make that happen, you're going to have to be overcoming the vestiges of the oligopoly, the aristocracy in the U.S., because they're still going to have the guns and they're still going to have a lot of power. So to the extent that we get to make that happen, it has to happen through elections, or it has to happen through civil unrest if they don't let us have elections. So this is going to be an incredibly messy time because the argument's going to be really contentious because a lot of people flatly disagree with the idea that we are not authoritarian enough. They would like a dictator. The idea of Plato's philosopher king, if you had to read that book back in college philosophy class, where the best form of government is an all-powerful ruler who also happens to be the smartest and best person in that society. You take that guy and you hand them absolute power, and they will create a just and efficient and successful society. So a lot of people envision that kind of a society with somebody just like them running the show, right? And that's true on the right and the left. So we got to get over that. We have to recognize, or those people have to recognize, that the idea of power is inherently corrupting. And the only society that has staying power is one where government is limited, where it's only going to be able to do certain things, because to be able to do more than that will create a monster. If we gave the cops unlimited power, they could catch a lot of criminals, but they would become the criminals if they had unlimited power. So we limit their power, and we understand that means some guilty people go free. There it is. And we kind of need to extend that idea to the economic realm, where government is not going to be able to do everything, but it will do the most important things, and it will do it in a sustainable way, so that we have 100 years or 500 years with this system, because it won't do unsustainable things. And I think the odds of us being able to put something like that in place are less than 50-50, but that's the argument that we'll have to have when the time comes.
Yeah, well, in the very next chapter we're seeing already is talk of like universal inoculations being required if you want to be able to get a driver's license up or passport or that kind of thing. And it's like, so it is remarkable the amount of self-surveillance and overlording that people are seeming to line up for. It's like, we want to be protected from this. And you mentioned the wartime powers that get invoked in here. This has been framed as a war by our leaders, saying this is a war against the unseen enemy. So it's like, that's ideal. Now we got an unseen enemy. It's not just... Yeah,
see, governments love unseen enemies. And that's what terrorists are too, right? We there's no army out there waiting to be destroyed. They're just... We know they're out there, but we can't see them. And they always will be out there. So in that sense, you're right, that this is another one of those where it doesn't necessarily ever have to go away. Like the war never has to end.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's completely possible. So, okay, now I'm getting into maybe a little bit too deterministic a place here, but it could be that the financial crisis that is inevitably going to come will end up being a good thing, because it will shake everybody out of these misperceptions. It'll be such a big problem that we'll have to put a lot of this other stuff on a back burner for a while. And maybe we'll find out that they're okay on the back burner. We don't have to have a police state in order to stop terrorism. We don't have to have mandatory everything to stop a pandemic of this type. And it could be that gives us some perspective on the time, because right now it's terrifying. People who remember 9/11 are still terrified of terrorists, and people who are living through this pandemic, who have seen a loved one die, for instance, are very afraid about what it's going to do to their other loved ones. And so they're willing to give up a lot of freedom in return for protection from that thing that they saw happen. They know it can happen. Yeah. It's a real thing. And so, that we're giving up some freedom right now is completely understandable. That's always how it works in war. And so the real question is, will this war end? And when is it going to end? And let us get back to normal. And I think this has potentially a technical fix. Maybe we come up with a cure, like not a vaccine necessarily, but just a shot. You go to the doctor, you get the shot, and the virus is flushed out of your system.
Or simpler than that, you take the proper nutritional things and you become much stronger. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe we'll all become all about our immune systems now, which would be a great thing, right? We'll live a lot healthier lives if that's the attitude that we all have to take.
Well, it's certainly got the popular attention. I'll give you that, and there's reason for hope, I guess, that can cause people to come out of their navel gazing long enough to realize that there's more to life than just seeking pleasure and convenience and comfort, and so that maybe they'll be educated, willing to learn about options that they need to participate in order to have the fruits of liberty that there's a burden they need to carry as part of that. It just seems like the temptations are just ever so much greater on the other side of that option, and that is that you can just say, oh my gosh, now we really do need all of those restrictions and all of those controls and all that consistency at the global level, the national level. Forget the local level. Local level is irrelevant now. It's got to be global. It's got to be national. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I'm just gravely concerned about that. But okay, we're going to keep this conversation going. Can you talk to us? You mentioned in passing about one of the things that's different now is this global debt. Okay, and anytime you're talking about debt, you're talking about two sides. One person's asset is another person's liability. So who's holding all the assets of all the individual households, the cities, the states, the counties, the countries? If everybody and companies, if everybody's in debt, who's holding the other side of that?
Well, when you borrow money, let's say you go out and take out a car loan, and more than likely that loan is bundled into a bond which contains thousands or hundreds of other car loans. That bond issue is chopped up into $1,000 pieces and sold to institutional investors around the world. In other words, hedge funds will borrow a bunch of money and buy these things and then try to make leverage profits, or pension funds will just take them and collect the interest in order to have enough money to pay the teachers and firefighters and policemen, the benefits. So that's where a lot of it is. And also a lot of it is now in central bank balance sheets, where the central banks have just started creating huge amounts of currency out of thin air and then buying bonds on the open market. So, for instance, in Japan, the Bank of Japan owns pretty much all the Japanese government debt, which means
and most of the Nikkei index, by the way, right?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, see, that's a later stage in the process. They started out by buying high-grade debt. And
high-graded first, okay.
All right. Yeah, high-graded first. And then they find out that's not enough, that the economy is still, because it's over-leveraged, isn't growing fast enough. So then they move on to what they're doing now. U.S. Fed is buying junk bonds
right.
and ETFs. The Japanese central bank, as you said, is one of the biggest stockholders in the country. And the European Central Bank has bought all kinds of stuff. And, they're buying Italian bonds, which are basically junk bonds by any other name, even though they're called sovereign debt. Now, that's not going to work. And so they're going to have to go on to the next level of asset purchases, which might be, let's say your car loan was subprime, because you've already maxed out 20 credit cards.
And I got laid off and they can't pay my rent and all that. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So maybe the central banks don't want to buy those bonds just yet, but they will have to at some point, and they do that by you buy it from the holder, whether it's a pension fund or a hedge fund, and give those guys cash in return. So presumably they're going to spend that cash and the economy is going to grow. That's the thinking behind QE. But if it has to grow over time, and there's a finite amount of quote unquote investment grade assets out there, then they end up working their way further and further down the barrel till they're just scraping the bottom. And what you end up with is kind of a leveraged buyout of the private sector by the government.
Yeah.
And we are headed that way fast, where the government basically owns most of the big companies out there and a lot of the smaller companies. And that's not capitalism anymore either. That's just a backdoor way to get to a Marxist kind of economy, where the means of production are owned by the state. They say it's owned by the people, but it's actually owned by the handful of guys in charge of the government. And that people don't see we're headed that way is a very scary realization, because it's kind of obvious and it's a horrendous place to end up. And we're going that way at an accelerating rate right now.
Please make two distinctions for us. One, you just said owned by the government, but isn't this owned by the central banks? And the central banks are not the government. Is that true?
No. Well, I mean, it's technically legally true, but you don't want to think of these things as separate entities. You want to think of them as divisions, governments, central banks, and the big money center banks as divisions in a single organization whose job is to increase its own power. So
far I'm tracking you. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the Fed buys the government's bonds. Okay. That's a transaction between two different entities. And then the Fed rebates the interest on those bonds to the government. So the government's interest cost is zero. So basically what happened was the government, which is in this case the Fed, just printed enough money to run the government and handed that money to the government, which is just a different division of the same company. And then the big money center banks just sit there and get fat from all the transactions that are generated by all that stuff. So in no sense are these separate organizations. Because look what happens when the big banks get into trouble. Are they allowed to fail? No. One other part of their organization just shuffles some money from that part of the organization over to them. In other words, the Fed cuts interest rates, and the Treasury Department guarantees a bunch of the big banks' debt, and the big banks are bailed out. So it's not a transaction between hands-off organizations. There's no Chinese wall between these things. And the personnel go back and forth too. I mean, the same guys who ran Goldman Sachs and Citigroup 5 years ago run the Treasury Department today.
And the Fed. The Fed stockholders, yeah.
Yeah. And the Federal Reserve governors themselves go back and forth between other branches of the government and hedge funds. I mean, Alan Greenspan, where he's working at now, Citadel, the biggest, or is that Ben Bernanke? Okay, I forget. One of our former Fed chairmen are working at the biggest high-frequency trading hedge fund on Wall Street. Now, if those are separate organizations, then it's highly unlikely that a chairman of the Fed would have any skills that would translate into high-frequency trading. And the fact is they don't. But they're a nice figurehead. They open a lot of doors. They keep the regulators at bay. And so that's how that works. The regulators, it's a revolving door between the regulators, which are the government, and the entities that they regulate. There's a term for that called regulatory capture, where the companies that are being regulated end up owning the regulators and thereby owning the government. And that's where we are now.
All right. So we got the picture of this commingled conflict of interest, but here's what I'm trying to get at. All this debt that's being spirally created, just a hockey stick up, up, up. Now we were doing whatever, less than $1 trillion a year, and $1 trillion a year, $1.5 trillion a year. Now we're doing whatever, $1 trillion a couple times a week or something. Mm-hmm. Are we on a hook for that as citizens? Our children and our grandchildren on the hook to pay that off? Because we're not getting consulted. It's, hey guys, do you want you and your kids and your grandkids to be on the hook for umpteen $1 trillion forever, so that we can get through this hard patch here? And by the way, we're going to take care of our buddies first. Am I overstating that question, or is that actually what's going on?
You're stating the situation correctly, but I don't think the average voter and the average consumer understands much of this yet.
That's my concern.
So, yeah. I mean, they don't know the technicalities of the situation that they're in. And there's a reason for that too. Is because we've come through one of the easiest stretches in human history because we had that unlimited credit card. We had a central bank that could create money in unlimited quantities with no consequence, and governments that could therefore borrow unlimited amounts of money with no consequence. So the average person just thinks the world is this way, that there are always credit card solicitations in your mailbox. You can always get a mortgage at the bank downtown. Your house will always go up in value. Your stock portfolio will always go up. Your pension is insanely generous, and it will be there waiting for you, or Social Security or Medicare. Those, we grew up being told and having it be demonstrated that all of that stuff was true. And the fact that none of it is actually true hasn't sunk in yet. So that's when things get really intense because, we kind of think we've had some civil unrest here with Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party and stuff like that, but we haven't seen anything like what's coming when, for instance, Chicago firefighters find out that the money for their pension is not there anymore and they're only going to get half of what they thought they were going to get. Or when real inflation, in other words, the real value of the dollar's decline is twice the cost of living increase on Social Security. Or when huge sections of the country just get laid off because stuff's not working anymore. People will hit the streets when that happens. And that will be part of the conversation. It's not all going to be peaceful, I don't think. Like Gerald Celente likes to say, when people have nothing left to lose, they lose it. And we're seeing that around the world. I mean, France has that going on right now, and Chile and Hong Kong. There is serious civil unrest in the world. But to Americans, again, because life has been so easy for us in a lot of ways, we don't really see that as a possibility. But it'll be part of the mix when the time comes. And unfortunately, the way life works a lot of the time is that you don't realize what you were doing wrong in your actual situation and what your true interests are until after it's kind of too late to fix most of what went wrong, fix most of your mistakes. And that's clearly the case for Americans. We've been screwing up on a lot of different levels for decades now. And there's no way you fix that painlessly. You got to go through the losses that come from all this malinvestment. In other words, so much stuff has been built here and invested in that never should have been built or invested in. And it has to go to its actual value, which is to say 10% of what we put into it in a lot of cases. And so we, the American people, have to eat those losses. And it's possible that we end up with some kind of a French Revolution thing where the peasants grab their pitchforks and they go after the oligarchs in some kind of a really satisfying spasm. It could be really cathartic. Hopefully it's just a financial French Revolution, not an actual physical one where they chop people's heads off. But it's liable to be something like that, where we flat out, or voters flat out, confiscate all the assets of the 1%. I mean, if Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were the likely presidents in this next election, then there would be wealth taxes, there would be capital controls. We would be beginning that process. And when things get really bad, we will vote for people who have a platform like that. We'll give you free stuff by taking it away from the guys who stole it from you in the first place. That's going to sell, and so there's no doubt that we will go through a period like that. The only question is, can we come out of the other end of that with something sustainable and humane and viable, and that's not a guarantee at all. It's just it's a challenge for what's left of the baby boomer generation and for the guys who come after that. But it's not necessarily an easy challenge. It's something that may not work, probably won't work, but that's sort of, that is, for instance, the millennials' World War I or World War II. That's the big challenge they face as a generation. And they have to win. They have to succeed at creating something that's viable out of the rubble of what we have built now. But there's no guarantee that they do. The good guys don't always win.
Yeah, especially when they're awakening from being totally unprepared, being unfit and unprepared for the challenge ahead, and facing forces that have been preparing for decades, if not centuries. With nowadays, it's drone technology and directed energy weapons and all kinds of things. So pitchforks aren't going to go very far.
Yeah. It remains to be seen what 1 million people in the plaza at Washington, D.C. will do. That's what we'll find out. Whether that has any kind of an impact on the guys with the drones and the particle beam weapons, but who knows? We'll see.
We have now, to bring it back to a very personal level, which we were starting to walk down that path, and there's a question here from a viewer, and this kind of takes us maybe off what people usually would ask you, but it gets the thought process going. James Reedy asks, have we thought enough about what will be our response when hungry children come to our homes asking for food? The sad part is that we will be overrun by potentially hostile or violent people once we help the first person.
Yeah, well, that's always been the survivalist's point of view, right? That you can stockpile stuff, and you can have enough for you and your family. But then the next question is, how do you keep it once you have it? Because if you don't look like you're starving, and lots of other people are going without, and everybody is armed, then you kind of got a civil war, a little mini civil war on your hands. And that's the tricky part of the whole thing. It's easy to put some food in your garage and have some silver coins stashed that you can use for transactions when things get really crazy. But it's hard to keep those things once people figure out you have them. So when you spend that first silver coin, you're telling the world that you're a target. And when your kids are well fed. So now that's an extreme scenario, and I don't necessarily buy into a food shortage kind of scenario in America. I mean, downtown in cities, yes, but for most of the country, there's a lot of farmland out there, and there's a lot of productive capacity, and there would be no reason for, say, the organic farm on the edge of town to stop working if there are food shortages, right? You'd think they would expand. So you think the market would continue to operate in that sense. I
have to interject. Just two stories just came out in the last day. One is that major meatpacking operations in the U.S. Shutting down because of COVID-19, that kind of thing. The other is a close acquaintance of ours, a good friend actually, whose son couldn't buy a garden hose and seeds at the local hardware store because their governor says that falls into the category of non-essential things. So now we've got people who can't even put in a garden this year to do small-scale farming, if you want to call it that, because those are deemed by the state non-essential. So you can get in line at the official sources of the supply chain to go get your food from, but you can't create your own.
Well, yeah. See, I was thinking of the eventual financial crisis when the systems don't work anymore because of all the over borrowing and over leveraging that we did to get here. A pandemic is kind of a different animal. You're right. It has the potential to shut down a lot of different parts of the country. And if this thing goes on, yes, we could see shortages of all kinds of things, or we could just turn around and bite the bullet, send everybody back to work. So we're producing stuff, but we're seeing a lot of illness while we're building up herd immunity. And that's if the food supply system shuts down, then it's probably going to look like a less bad option to just put everybody back to work. So I think that's what we would do before we starve. However, in a financial crisis, when things stop working, it'll be a different set of things that stop working. So we need to know what kind of a crisis that we're in at the moment. And we won't know that until we see how the virus thing plays out, because they're testing treatments all over the place. And if the worst case scenario is a mandatory vaccination that works, we lose that piece of civil liberties, but we get to eat, I think a lot of people will definitely choose the vaccination. And we have some history on our side of good vaccinations. Polio and smallpox wiped out monstrous diseases that killed millions of people. And the vaccination thing as a means of social control is kind of a recent idea. And it's one of those things where we took an idea that was good to begin with, and we kind of perverted it, like we did with asset-backed bonds, right? Where the original versions of mortgage-backed securities were completely benign, and then we went crazy and caused a giant crisis. And I think you could argue that vaccinations have gone that route to where now it's, 50 vaccinations that you've got to get your kid? It's
constantly,
an insane number.
And the small little tiny babies that are receiving those on a more frequent basis than ever. And there's the mercury preservatives in them and so on, and aluminum and so on.
Even if everything in each vaccine is completely benign, there's no way to test what happens with the combination of them in the human body, right? No, So it's understandable that people are leery of getting their kids all the vaccinations that are recommended. I totally get that. But if there's a single shot with one set of virus remnants in it, and it will stop you from getting the coronavirus, which killed your father a month ago. A lot of people are going to say, all right, I have to do it. You're telling me I have to do it, but all right, I'll do it because it seems like it's better than the alternative. We will probably go for that as a society, but just a treatment would be better. Something where you take a pill, like you said, whatever. It just cures the disease, and that's that. And there's a lot of brain power at work on something like that right now. So it's reasonable to believe that a treatment will come along that actually turns this thing from an existential threat into an ongoing annoyance, like the flu or something like that. It lowers it to, flu kills a lot of people. But if coronavirus can be turned into something that's understandable and measurable so that we know its limits, then that would probably be acceptable to most people. And then we get beyond it, and the current lockdown, loss of civil liberties would be rolled back, and maybe this wouldn't be seen as another step on the road towards dictatorship, because we would roll back a lot of that stuff. But we still have the Patriot Act and everything.
That's the thing is, we're going on this. You're going on this thesis that the loss of liberties were actually a whether misguided or not, whatever, or proportionate or not, they were a response to a existential crisis. And that's a supposition, and others suppose that actually there's been a clear direction of progression towards the loss of those liberties anyway, and this was just a moment in which to blindingly rapidly enact things that we may never see rolled back. So it'll be interesting to see what happens going forward.
Yeah, but we'll find out. Let's say they cure coronavirus, and the government is still tracking our movements and telling us where we can't go, and we decide we're going to go wherever we feel like. Then we'll find out whether they start shooting people or whether they just get out of the way and say, all right, go back to church if you want to. Go to that basketball game, and it's up to you from now on. And, I suspect that people are going to want to go back to church and to basketball games.
People want their freedom.
Yeah, heck yeah.
But that doesn't mean that we won't. There's quite it's really remarkable, especially when you talked about the younger generation who have to rise up and take some responsibility for themselves that we haven't prepared them for going forward, who are the ones that were the ones who are rallying behind the modern monetary theory promoters are saying we can give free universal basic income to everyone, and free college education to everyone, and free medical care to everyone, and free this to everyone. It's like, yeah, that's right. Those are intrinsic rights. And then now, talking about, when you talk about tracking everyone, it's like, well, yeah, because we made it just by the skin of our teeth through that coronavirus thing, but now we'll be better prepared if we know where everybody is all the time. Then we can make sure that as soon as we know anybody is infected, we can, because there were even apps that sprang up even in the current crisis, where tracking, so that social people, you could see on your phone whether there's anybody infected in the store with you while you're there, that kind of thing. And it all can seem quite reasonable to people who think that there's a benefit for themselves in there. But anyway, that's it's going to be an interesting world ahead.
Yeah, there's a constant battle between surveillance technology and human freedom around the world right now, right? We know what's going on in China, where they have that social credit score, where you literally can't take a first-class plane flight if your social credit score is too low. And because of that, you have to adhere to government dictates in order to keep your social credit score at a level that lets you live a normal life.
And be careful who you associate with and what you say.
Yeah. And we're heading towards a private sector driven version of that right now, where Google and Facebook are keeping track of us, and they're able to use that, what they learn, in certain ways, to sell us stuff or to steer us in certain directions and affect our opinions. And there has to come a point where we figure that out and push back in a really meaningful way. In other words, that's the battle that's coming. Freedom isn't just given to you, because there are always forces that want to take it away. There are always powers that would like to increase in size and scope at your expense. And the idea that you have any natural rights that don't have to be protected,
that you don't also have to fight for.
Yeah, you do. You in every generation, you have to do stuff
just
like that.
Just because they are right doesn't mean somebody's going to hand them to you. Yeah.
Right. And the old, I think it's Thomas Jefferson, right? The tree of liberty must every once in a while be watered with the blood of patriots. And that is kind of how it works. And we're in a cycle now where authoritarianism is increasing, and a lot of that is technology driven, because it's giving insane powers to governments right now, and they're looking for excuses to abuse those powers. I totally agree with all of that. I'm just saying that that it's not a done deal yet. We can push back, and we can change the terms of debate in a way that that opens up the scope for individual freedom again. And, part of that obviously is sound money. If you take away that power from governments, you're halfway home to creating a society in which individuals are free again. But there's a lot of other stuff that has to be done, and surveillance capitalism is this huge risk that I think people are just starting to figure out. Like, people kind of get that Facebook's privacy settings are not, the default setting on those things is not favorable to you as a user of Facebook, right? You've got to go in and actually change their privacy settings, and that's a revelation to a lot of people.
Yeah.
I don't think people got that at first, and now most people get that. So there are countervailing technologies out there that you can use to minimize your footprint online. You can go partially invisible, and as people figure that out, then we've got this really interesting dynamic where freedom pushes back against authoritarianism. And I'm looking forward to that. I think it's going to happen in the financial realm, and I think it's going to happen in the political realm. And I don't think, the outcome's guaranteed. The bad guys could win, but the good guys are not without tools. And, Edward Snowden, for instance, if you force me to pick one person to be our Plato's philosopher prince, here, and I had to pick a dictator to obey, I would be Edward Snowden, because the guy seems to get this stuff. He gets surveillance capitalism.
Okay, so before we let you go, I want you to weigh in on this last point. There's so much more. This is very rich topic, but people are talking about, you just brought up real money, okay? And then other people are talking about our ability to speak the truth and be told the truth. So if we could just hit those, please. So before we leave the topic of money, do you believe personally that paper cash currency will survive? How long will that be meaningful? By the end of this year, will it be no longer meaningful? Will it be 5 years? Do you see that as doomed? And then contrasting that to other forms of money, whether it's gold and silver, whether it's cryptocurrencies. You mentioned this dynamic that the little guy can have tools too. So I think that would be helpful if you could tell us what you believe lies ahead for our ability to use currency or true money.
Well, governments for decades now have really wanted to get rid of cash, for a couple of reasons. One is because it's a hassle. It costs them a lot of money, and it's just a lot of busy work from their point of view compared to electronic transactions. And the other reason is that cash is the last private mechanism for transacting out there. You take that away, and everything you buy and sell goes into a big database and can be searched and used against you by an unscrupulous government or by companies that are de facto an unscrupulous government. So a big part of the sound money transition is going to have to deal with that, because even if we're on, say, a gold standard, where the money supply is strictly controlled by a basis in precious metals, if everything we do is electronic and traceable, and in that way makes us basically transparent to governments, then we didn't completely win. So we need to
privacy.
We did not get privacy, and so we need to figure out something that functions like cash, that allows us to transact anonymously, and we need to make that immune to money laundering at the same time. And that's the big challenge, because if you make something anonymous, then the drug dealers and the terrorists have been handed this weapon they can use to hurt the rest of the world. So we got to figure out how that works. And I'm not sure what the answer is. It could be that silver coins end up being the way we transact, or it could be some crypto-related thing where the algorithm or the blockchain gives you a certain amount of anonymity and frictionless transactions, and in that way complements gold as the basis of the monetary system. See, that because there's a technological component to that, that's still to be worked out. We'll probably, hopefully try a lot of different variations on the theme of, crypto gold combinations and silver as the cash that you carry around and stuff like that, and see how that goes. And hopefully we come up with something that works. But right now, there's just a lot of unrelated possibilities as components to the next monetary system. But that's what we do best. That's what free markets do best, is take a lot of different possibilities and sift it through real world experience to come up with something that works really well. And so that I'm not worried about. I think if we just have a lot of different ways of transacting and storing wealth out there, we'll hit upon the ones that work best. And then we'll combine them into a monetary system that works. That's all completely doable. It's more getting the aristocracy to allow it to happen that's the hard part.
Okay, so I know we're short on time, so I want to get back to that last point then about the truth, about being able to speak the truth and being able to be told the truth. Boom Fishing says, off of our normal topics, what would it take for the mainstream media to be forced into telling the truth to people? Or we have, quote, been so thoroughly propagandized that the few of us seeing clearly will always be considered crazy? Okay.
The one government intervention in the marketplace that I'm totally in favor of is antitrust laws. After the Great Depression, we correctly, or the U.S. at the time, correctly concluded that one of the problems with the Roaring '20s was that you had these gigantic companies that were able to corrupt their markets by virtue of their size. So they went in and they broke them up. They called that trust busting.
Yep.
Because those big companies were called trusts. So the antitrust laws, and they broke up the big banks, and they separated out investment banks from banks that could take deposits, and that worked for a really long time. So as far as the media goes, we need to do something like that, where right now, 6 giant corporations control most of what we would call the mainstream media. So, if you apply antitrust to that and you say, nobody's allowed to have more than 1/20th of the media market, boom. Break up all these companies, and you would at least create a playing field in which there's some competition. Now, at the same time, even if that doesn't happen, the internet is this Wild West kind of place already. I mean, your show, people don't have to go to Fox News or MSNBC. They can just tune into you, and they can hear people telling what they consider to be the truth about things in ways that you don't hear in the mainstream media, because maybe it conflicts with our war aims or corporate profitability or whatever. Joe Rogan, for instance, is a good example of that. He's been in the news a lot lately. The guy's like a fight promoter and basically a comic, a stand-up comic, but he has created this podcast show that now gets millions of views. and is as influential as any talking head on MSNBC is. He said, "Oh, you know what? I think I might vote for Bernie this time." And there was this firestorm. He just threw that out there, and half of the mainstream media went nuts over it because he has that kind of power because he's got a big audience, and he created that from scratch. And so that's possible for all the rest of us to do too. And so even if we don't end up with antitrust laws breaking up corporate media, there will still be no shortage of other voices out there until they start shutting down the internet. So until that happens, I guess in my life, I don't see it as a big problem because I don't bother with the mainstream media. I spend most of my days digging into stuff like your show and getting most of my information from that.
Right,
and
right.
There's no reason why other people can't do the same thing.
Right. Yeah, so we got to figure out how to get a alternate internet that runs on ham radios or something that we can that can't be shut down. We've been speaking with John Rubino, the founder of DollarCollapse.com. John, we could go on, and we just scratched the surface. We've asked 1 out of 20 of our viewer questions that have been submitted ahead of your visit here, but we're just so grateful for you spending time with us here on Liberty and Finance and Reluctant Preppers.
Thanks, Donegan. Enjoyed it.
If you've decided that now is the right time for you to protect your family's financial future by acquiring physical precious metals, gold and silver, I'm delighted to let you know that I have now become a licensed dealer's representative for Miles Franklin, one of the oldest and most trusted names in bullion dealerships. And we can provide you with physical delivery to your personal possession or to professional vault storage or precious metals IRAs. Just email me at libertyandfinance@protonmail.com, and please include your name and phone number in your email to libertyandfinance@protonmail.com. We'll get right back with you and find out how to best meet your needs so that you can either begin or increase your acquisition of physical precious metals now and protect your family's future starting today.